Hello again, and welcome to the second video in the Gaming Through History series, where we're moving on to the medieval period. So it's quite a jump. So we've gone from the tail end of the Roman Republican period. So in the case of Creative Assembly, that was around about the year zero with Rome 2, and for Paradox, that was in the a hard stop in the year 27 BCE with Imperator Rome. And so we're jumping forward, you know, more than 1,000 years for both games. Um, and yeah, well, just I suppose just to comment on that. I mean, there are, more games within that period, particularly for the Creative Assembly's Total War series. And I suppose that is largely to the extent to which Creative Assembly has focused over the years on melee combat, um, primarily with the sort of rock, paper, scissors format of sort of spear infantry, heavy infantry, archers, cavalry. And so that has, made it easier, if you will, for Creative Assembly to create more games that exist, within that sort of early, late Roman, early medieval period, and games I'm talking about sort of Thrones of Britannia, Attila, to a certain extent, Three Kingdoms over in China. But I'm not going to be talking about those games because there isn't a sort of natural parallel from Paradox. Paradox, a game series that doesn't focus on combat, at least not in that kind of intimate way where you're leading armies on the battlefield, kind of hasn't been drawn necessarily to this kind of early and pre-medieval period. And so we do jump forward quite a step to the medieval period and looking at two games that are in contrast to the Roman Republican period, in contrast to Rome 2 and Imperator Rome, two games that are much loved by fans of the franchises, of the franchises. And for me, yeah, two of my favorite games um, in this whole series. Is that anything to do with the medieval period itself? I mean, it might be. Certainly my interest and fascination in history started off, visiting castles, as a kid across the UK. I was, the idea of the medieval knight, there's a lot of things that, are really enigmatic and really fascinating about the medieval period. But these are just well created games. I mean, they are slightly older. Again, you can look at those dates there, well received by critics, and then very well received by the audience. In both instances, scoring very highly. And I suppose that says as much for the game design as it says for the historical period. I suppose perhaps it was easier for Creative Assembly, for example, to create a Medieval 2 game, coming from Rome 1 in this point. It's slightly earlier in the sort of evolution, if you like, of the Total War formula. It's a simple game, but it's just incredibly enjoyable. In terms of its history, it's very problematic, and we'll come to that in due course. So it's certainly a lot less to do with history. I mean, throughout this series, I'm looking to play the core vanilla game. And the core vanilla Medieval 2 has a lot of issues with its history. Crusader Kings 2 does it in a very, very different way, and does its history very, very differently. And that game design choice really helps lend the historical authenticity to Crusader Kings 2 that is lacking in Medieval 2. But yeah, we are certainly on sort of solid ground here, at least in terms of games that are loved by fans of both series. So getting into their history then. So Medieval 2 starts in 1080 and wraps up in around 1530. Now, depending on what campaign victory conditions you're doing, the game will end when you complete those victory conditions. So it can end, it can end very, very quickly, or I kind of played very slowly and very patiently and rather sort of over cautiously, if you like, to prolong the game experience. But the game does span, a significant period of time. Again, when you looked at the Rome games, we were talking about around about 250 to 300 years, whereas here we're talking about the best part of 500 years. So there are an awful lot of anachronisms within Medieval 2 because of that very long time period. There isn't a sort of technology tree. This is an older Total War game. Before technology trees were really a thing. So that does mean that, the overall gameplay, the feel of the world, it might be 500 years, but it doesn't feel remarkably different, which is certainly anachronistic considering, we're ending the game, in the Renaissance period, a time of great scientific and social and economic change. There's certainly a lot of issues there with how Medieval 2 goes about portraying its history. It kind of does it through chapters. Now, I've kind of called them chapters here, but they aren't chapters in game. There's not much made of them, and I think the design. I think they could have done more, if you like, of these chapters to really differentiate sections of the game. The first being the sort of the Mongol invasion. I mean, this has very powerful armies landing in the east of the map. So if you're playing in the east of the map, it very much influences and kind of dictates how your campaign develops, as you're likely suddenly obliged to play a very defensive style as you try to beat back the Mongol hordes. The second chapter I've noted there that comes in around about halfway through the campaign is gunpowder. And this is very interesting because you start the game very much focused on castles, on castles basically being impenetrable. With a very small garrison, you can defend a castle against an enormous army. And so it's quite possible to be quite aggressive in the early game because you don't have to, because castles are such great defensive points, if you can control key strategic areas of the map, then you can, move armies around quite freely and sort of push back against your enemy. Whereas with the invention of gunpowder, suddenly even the most advanced castles are incredibly vulnerable. So you'll likely have to increase your garrisons. It leads to a slightly more cautious gameplay style, because if you're defeated in the field, then your castles become more vulnerable, and a lot more of your defense doesn't happen necessarily at your castle, but outside. So you can also use sort of, you can attack offensively for defensive means, if you will. So your strategy does shift. It's far easier to destroy an army in the field than it is to have them attack your castle and destroy them there, necessarily, if you don't have the garrison and they have artillery. Whereas before gunpowder, it was quite the opposite. You could be quite aggressive in the field, knowing that you would have more than adequate defense, from a minor garrison in the castle. So that shifts the gameplay quite significantly. The next one is the Plague. Again, a big gameplay shift. The game kind of slips into neutral. You're expanding, and then suddenly your economy can suffer. Your population is going to decrease. You might lose significant characters that die to the plague. So a very significant shift with the plague mechanic. The Timurids, then, it's another Eastern invasion. So again, if you're a faction out in the East, that's another period of great pain as you kind of force back these enormous high-powered armies. And then the final one that happens quite late in the game, and again, you feel that not enough is made of it really, is that the world is round, and that's kind of a trigger for factions in Europe to be able to travel to the Americas. And it takes a lot of turns to sail a ship from, even the very western parts of Europe to the American areas. So very late in the campaign, you can start to create a colonial empire. So it's a shame really that there isn't more made of these different chapters that kind of define how the medieval period is portrayed through the Medieval 2 campaign. Crusader Kings 2, on the other hand, its kind of main start date, at least again for the sort of the vanilla campaign, is 1066. There are two start dates in 1066, one before and one after the Norman invasion of England. So you can choose to play as Duke William of Normandy, the Bastard, before he achieves the throne of England, or you can choose to play as the Norman dynasty in control of the English throne. Obviously, other aspects of the map differ, but the two 1066 start dates are simply for that, to have a sort of before or after start date for the Norman invasion. With various DLCs, though, the start date gets pushed back, nearly another 300 years, with the Charlemagne DLC allowing you to experience the growth of sort of early nationhood within Europe as Charlemagne carves out his Frankish empire. And then the Old God sits in between those start dates in 867, focusing on Viking raids and the conflict, if you like, across Northern Europe, in particular between pagan faiths and Christian faith. So in terms of how to discuss the history, Crusader Kings with the full DLC, starting in the Charlemagne, Age of Charlemagne, in 1769, brings you almost 700 years worth of history, ending in 1453. So there's about 80 years difference in endpoints, I suppose. But again, it doesn't have a massive difference in how the history feels. Basically, if you've got close to 1530 in Medieval 2, or you've got close to 1453 in Crusader Kings 2, it's likely you've kind of achieved a level of dominance that means that there's kind of little intrigue to the gameplay. Now, the way the games the way campaigns develop is very different because of the differences in sort of gameplay focus. In Medieval 2, once again, you play, broadly speaking, as the nation. You are France. You control the armies, you control the characters, you control the diplomacy. Crusader Kings 2, on the other hand, you control the dynasty. So you do play as the head of a dynasty. And it's just a fantastic way to do it. It's a wonderful way of representing the medieval period. And if you like, the medieval period sits in this position of an evolution from, pre-Roman. Again, we're focusing on Europe here, but the themes exist across the different areas of the map. But we're at a point where in the pre-Roman, the post-Roman period, you have the kind of warlord politics, where territories are controlled by those that wield the most sort of power. That sort of coalesces into nations. Charlemagne, a great sort of unifier within Europe. And by the end of the game, we're heading into the Renaissance period, as we've said, expansion, great developments in terms of sort of social thinking. The Black Death is something of a social and economic evolutionary factor. You got to move towards greater social fluidity. So you have that move from warlord into dynastic statehood, heading towards sort of modern sort of modern nationhood, if you like. But a defining feature of that medieval period is the relevance of dynasties and how they bridge the gap between sort of warlord politics into national politics. So to portray the medieval period through this control a dynasty overall game design is inspired, and it's really done exceptionally well. So throughout the game, you are the leader of a dynasty at any given time, and it's fun. It's so fascinating. You do end up in the most incredible positions. The most incredible kind of experiences as your sex life and your personal relationships, having a good marriage, etc. It's a huge part of the game in Crusader Kings 2, and that is very reflective of medieval priorities for families as they attempted to coalesce and grow wealth, power, and stature. So two games that do their history quite differently, both for sort of game design and game mechanical kind of features. But they've got a lot to portray. I mean, it's incredible that Crusader Kings 2 lasts over 700 years. It's impossible to kind of talk about all the things that occur within a game that spans that amount of time. Especially when you also factor in that, within those start dates, you can tick it over just by a matter of days to get ever so slightly different starts. I mean, they can be quite janky, and when I played these campaigns for this series, I've focused on the core start dates, but the amount of sort of historical divergence you can get within Crusader Kings 2 is incredible through the player's actions or the computer's actions, simply because there are just so many moving parts at any given point. Yeah, I mean, two phenomenal games with an awful lot that they're trying to portray, and we'll get into some of these core themes then. So, number one, I've gone with feudalism. Now, especially with a fairly Eurocentric view, but again, something that is portrayed, in various other areas of the map. Feudalism is something that defines the medieval period, and many of you will have seen feudalism as shown as sort of a pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid, it sort of portrays the sort of social and political economic hierarchy of medieval society. There wasn't much in the way of social fluidity, social movement. At the bottom, you have serfs, you have the peasant class, if you will, largely workers. As you move up the pyramid, you have sort of local rulers, regional rulers, all the way up to the monarch at the very, very top. But I think it's important to understand that there might not have been social movement, but there is still a degree of there's a lot of interaction and communication that goes up and down the pyramid. I mean, to a great extent, wealth flows up the pyramid. Wealth in terms of agricultural output, in terms of food, in terms of artisanal goods. They're created towards the bottom of the pyramid by agricultural workers, by blacksmiths and sort of skilled workers, and as part of payments, taxes, etc., that wealth will flow up the pyramid to the regional to the local landlords, the regional landlords, and then ultimately up as sort of tribute to the monarchs and the ruling classes. Also up the pyramid flows military power. If you're if you're putting together an army in the medieval period, you're reliant on those under you to provide troops. At the lower levels, it might be, basic infantry. The higher up the pyramid, the higher the wealth, then you'll be expecting better quality knights with armor provided, etc. So also sort of military power flows up the pyramid. And down from the pyramid, sort of from the ruling monarchs down to the peasant class, flows prestige and protection. The kind of deal of your feudal lord is, I will provide, if you are a peasant, I will work the land, I will provide output from your land. You're responsible for protecting that land. You're responsible for maintaining peace and projecting our power locally. And then that obviously expands all the way to the top of the nation. The monarch is responsible for protecting the nation, maintaining the borders, and projecting power and prestige externally. And again, it's not fluid, but if there are points of friction, if there are issues in that pyramid, then yeah, I mean, revolutions do happen. A dysfunctional landlord that's unable to control banditry within his territory may well face the wrath of the local peasant population, or may well face the wrath of their liege lord, who declares them incapable, declares them inept, and has them removed from position, or even far worse. So social mobility isn't necessarily a thing, but that's not to say that within feudalism, power didn't flow up and down the pyramid to certain extents. Obviously, the higher up the pyramid, the more decisions you're able to make on those below you, basically. So ultimate power flows to the top of the pyramid. But it's this relationship that kind of underpins the medieval period. And I mean, mentioned it earlier with the Black Death, that it is seen as a great factor in evolving feudalism from that rigid social hierarchy to something more fluid as we get into the Renaissance and the mercantilist period, as people are able to generate power through wealth, and not wealth through status within that social hierarchy, but through skills and through ability. So artisans and traders are able to move up the feudal pyramid, if you like. And in particular, that process is sort of accelerated by the Black Death, where you get immense destruction of life, huge losses, whole areas massively depopulated. And then suddenly those skilled artisans that sort of survive are of greater worth. They're able to travel and sell their skills, not just to sort of the lord they're obliged to, because they just sort of are of their territory, but they wield a certain amount of power. They can travel to be paid and to be better rewarded by a different lord. And so that does shift the dynamics a wee bit. There's a little bit more negotiating power towards the bottom of the pyramid that starts to erode this sort of rigid feudal idea. And then, as I say, sort of mercantilism and the idea that through the accumulation of material wealth that you can kind of acquire power in other areas, is kind of a defining factor in the movement of the medieval period into the Renaissance and sort of the early modern period. So feudalism kind of defines the medieval period. And so if you're going to create a game that is set in the medieval period, then you have to be able to portray that. And it's chalk and cheese. For Crusader Kings 2, it is absolutely central to the game. And that's exactly as we talked about, because you are ruling a dynasty, there is a social hierarchy. You do have your kings, you have your dukes, you have your counts. Again, focusing on Europe here, but the structure is throughout the game. So, being able to, uh, you know, move up and down the pyramid to interact with that feudal hierarchy is absolutely central to how Crusader Kings 2 operates. Medieval 2, on the other hand, and we said it was problematic with its history, does very, very little to even acknowledge any kind of feudal hierarchy. And it's a shame that more wasn't done to integrate some mechanics that even have a nod towards feudalism. Medieval 1, for example, you can give characters titles. So, within your, family tree, you can kind of create a sense of hierarchy by giving a character a dukedom, or by making a character chancellor. So it does create a sort of sense of hierarchy. Whereas in Rome, in medieval 2, sorry, that just didn't port over. That wasn't adopted, which is such a shame. I mean, the other issue with medieval 2 is that the family trees are just really buggy. For example, if your king dies and they have a son who's not of age, then that son doesn't become the king. It can only pass to a character that has become an adult. So you do get really awkward situations where maybe your 50-year-old king dies and their son is 14, but as the character hasn't sort of generated yet and is still deemed underage, the title of king then pings off to somebody else in the tree. Which again, these were massive issues in the medieval period. If you didn't have that succession, if you didn't have that cohesion, that would lead to civil war. So, I think that theming of hierarchy, social structure, dynastic cohesion, it has to be there. And yeah, in medieval 2, it's really lacking. The second theme I thought I'd bring out is faith. And I think this is something that is perhaps difficult to represent for modern gaming audiences. How do you imbue a game with the importance of religion? How do you put faith as a central tenet to your game design when, you're not designing a game that is about faith? You're not designing a game that is meant for Christians or Muslims to experience, let's say, Christian or Muslim life, But nonetheless, go into the medieval period, faith was such a huge motivator, such a huge part of social interaction that, you have to have that there as a prominent theme. And again, in Crusader Kings 2, I think you can say they've done a very, very good job. One, if you're going to, in the scoring for the game, which I think is an interesting way of looking at how the game designers have looked to sort of frame the history. Like, how are you going to be successful in this game? How are you going to win the medieval period, for example? Well, in Crusader Kings 2, you can do it through faith. It is one of the scoring areas. So you can have a character that simply pursues a life of faith, becomes a key religious figure, generates a lot of prestige and a lot of, renown because of their faith. So you can have a whole gameplay style focused on faith. Another feature, obviously, of the medieval period that you haven't touched on, but that faith interacts with, of course, is the Crusades. And again, in both the start date of 1080 for medieval 2 and one of the key areas for, the long timeline of Crusader Kings 2 is the crusading period. And obviously Crusader Kings, Crusader in the very title, it obviously, points to the fact that, the Crusades and the conflict between East and West, between Christianity and Islam, is going to be a massive part of the game. And so that's one area in which both games put faith, very firmly at the heart of the game. Again, because Total War is a conflict-orientated franchise, it focuses on warfare. It's the Crusades are very much an excuse to push for conflict between the Christian factions of Central Europe and the Muslim factions of the East. So it's simply a mechanic for creating sort of expansionism in the Holy Land, let's say. Faith interactions with the Pope, it's there, but it's minimal. It's in no way as integrated as Crusader Kings 2, that really has a lot of mechanics around faith, not only to create areas of friction and to encourage conflict, but to simply live a godly life. And again, this comes back to the different estates within medieval society. You did have those that pray. It was an important function as much as any other, that you had rulers and that you had monasteries and that you had religious institutions that were there to provide for the good of the people. It's kind of like how you might think of, I don't know, the NHS in the UK today. I mean, not only did religious houses provide actual medical care, but it was also the spiritual care that they were responsible for. It was as important, if you like, for a medieval community to feel that they had a monastery or a church or any other institute of faith present that they could interact with, so that they could ensure the spiritual health of their community. So it really does have to be integrated, a strong sense of faith being a key motivating factor for any character or any faction in the game. And I think, again, it's somewhat chalk and cheese. With Medieval 2, because it's coming from the Total War MO, because it's pitched towards conflict, faith really is there as a mechanic to encourage conflict. Whereas Crusader Kings 2 is far more holistic in creating a world in which faith, religion, is a part of everyday life, not just a part of warfare. And I do love this screenshot. This was expansion here where I've created a Christian Arabian empire after a successful crusades. And this guy is pretty badass, old Sergios the Apostle II. Okay, moving on to number 3, political and battlefield evolution. And this is an interesting one because obviously we started off talking about the timescales. Medieval 2 has its chapters, but we are talking about 500 years of history and just a handful of chapters. It's like, it doesn't do enough to really to show, I'd say, the difference that exists between a society in 1080 and a society in 1530. You do get some of that with Crusader Kings 2. But again, it's quite linear in terms of its evolution. Nations coalesce, empires coalesce. If you're successful as a player, you've created something larger. But I don't know if either game really portrays any of the sort of social, political evolution. As we said with Medieval 2, the instigation, the introduction of gunpowder is fairly huge. But is it huge enough? We have the discovery of the Americas, but is it big enough? It happens so late in the game. Suddenly a whole new world is being explored, and exotic goods are entering the European market. There's a curiosity to explore, other uncharted oceans. Does it feel different? Do we get that renaissance? Do we really get that feeling of rebirth? I think both games are kind of a bit limited with that. And again, it is about game design to a certain extent. Medieval 2 focuses on conflict. How much does the conflict evolve? Like I say, gunpowder units, artillery, there is a change of tack. There are more powerful units, but are they different? Similar with Crusader Kings, things are bigger, the scale is increased, but is there an evolution? Does it feel different? I think in both of these aspects, both games kind of lean into sort of the medieval as sort of dark ages. They don't do enough, I'd say, to really show the development of art and science and culture that happens, particularly in the later medieval period. Again, perhaps because we're focusing on knights and armor and the clashing of swords. Neither game kind of pushes the envelope in terms of that sort of grander evolution. Medieval 2 massively lets itself down as well by having a lack of diversity of sort of political types. Within Crusader Kings 2, you can move policies, so you can, evolve the politics of a nation. But again, if you've achieved success, what you get is sort of bigger and better. You don't get a sense of evolution. Medieval 2, yeah, drops the ball significantly in its political diversity. The Holy Roman Empire isn't an elected monarchy. The Venetian republics aren't elective republics. They all have just hereditary systems that are, as I say, broken because you can't have juniors inheriting thrones, whereas children inherited thrones at all ages, because the bloodline, the authenticity and the legitimacy of the line was more important than just how old you were. Although, yes, if you put a 3-year-old on the throne, it's likely that an uncle might say, I'll do better than you, I'll have it for now, and then you get a bit of a civil war. So the political structures of the medieval period really are a massive factor in how the period evolves. You have to have the diversity of political structures. You have to have those inbuilt frictions modeled within a game in the medieval period. Crusader Kings 2 does do it in terms of hereditary styles, in terms of again, with the emphasis on dynastic gameplay, with its dynastic mechanics. Medieval 2 drops the ball significantly. So, scoring it, as you can imagine, I've sort of made it plain here that I'm a big fan of how Crusader Kings 2 does the medieval period. Really strong integration of faith and feudalism as mechanics. Like I say, there's a lack of validity, if you like, to the final one there, the political and battlefield evolution, because gameplay wise, evolution is somewhat forced. It doesn't have to happen. The scale increases, but there isn't a great sense that the world is changed come the end of the game. Fun factor again, yeah, very, very fun games. For Medieval 2, I've put Faith Innes 2 there because the Crusades in particular are such a core part of the game. They're reasonably well developed, and they do have features both for Islam and Christianity, basically the two faiths in the game. There is an Orthodox in there as well. You can deploy priests, etc., to kind of encourage convert populations, sow unrest, perhaps it's modeled in fairly simplistic terms. The Reconquista of Iberia, it's these sort of faith elements are there, but they are largely to encourage conflict, which is again a product of the nature of Creative Assembly's approach to Total War, particularly in this period before we sort of got more diversity of mechanics and sort of gameplay styles. And I've maybe been generous there with the battlefield and political and battlefield evolution as well. As I say, really lacking in terms of political structures within the game. But maybe I was just very generous with the gunpowder thing, because there's a sharp change in how the game plays, and that is an important part of both the game and how the period evolves. You do get that move away from castle structures. There is a move towards mobile professional armies because of castles losing their defensive dominance. It does do something quite interesting in the gameplay to create that dynamic evolution of battlefield approach and technology. So yeah, perhaps generous, but there we go. Crusader Kings 2 doing very well there with a solid 9 out of 10. Medieval 2 hamstrung a little bit by the basic mechanics of politics, diplomacy, and yeah, and yeah, politics. Yeah, hampered by total war. I suppose is the thing to say. Hampered by total war's emphasis on military engagement and conflict. The political, the social, the economic, the diplomatic. So many things that probably should be modeled through faith orientated mechanics, through feudalism orientated mechanics. Yeah, kind of tied down by that overall game development philosophy. So, how are we going to sort of score this? How does the game present history? Well, these are scores for Medieval 2. So kind of hard to do this because again, like the factions and the different campaigns don't play out you kind of alongside each other as they do in Paradox games. But in this instance, I played all of the factions that are available once all the factions are unlocked. Again, in vanilla Medieval 2, and I played the short campaign. So I felt that was the most historical way of playing things. So like I say, I played it very slowly, very conservatively, tried to take up as much of the period as possible, but ultimately gave myself quite meager objectives because I wasn't interested in creating, for example, a French Empire that spanned the map. I wasn't interested in coloring the map, light blue, but having more targeted conflicts with key rivals and creating a local empire and, perhaps, expanding into, the Holy Land, for example, after a successful crusade, that sort of thing. So fairly realistic, I'd say, ambition for a faction at the time. Now, in this instance, Milan is given an advantage in that one of your objectives is to destroy the HRE. So if you really go into the HRE, you're naturally going to expand more than other factions that have sort of smaller objectives because the HRE is such a big faction. And that's one factor why Milan are at the top, but also there's a great deal of wealth at the beginning of the game and throughout the game in the Italian peninsula. So if you're expanding as Milan, you're likely to expand north into the territories of the HRE, as well as south into the territories of, Venice, which is also one of your rivals, even the Papal States, and then down into the Sicily faction as well. So you're likely to take control of Italy as well as chunks of the HRE, which is an area of great wealth with big cities with great economic output. So perhaps unsurprising that Milan come out on top there, as much for sort of gameplay design as for actual player action. Similar to the HRE, you start out strong in an interesting position within Central Europe where you can trade, you can be a key trading conduit between East and West, as well as having the material output to field great armies that can push your empire north, south, east, and west. England's an interesting one in that you do start, you are an island nation. So, once you've established dominance of the islands of Great Britain and Ireland, then you are a powerful nation that can project power across the map. Um, Probably a fair few hundred years earlier than than would be expected in reality in our timeline. But you are very, it's very straightforward to create a local British Empire and then to, expand through France, through, Italy, Spain, etc. Like you are in a strong position. So geography, I think, plays a big role in how these successful nations are able to emerge. Denmark is a similar example in that there are no other factions within Scandinavia, so it's quite straightforward to establish dominance in Scandinavia in a way that Denmark never did in the medieval period, at least. And then having formed a sort of Scandinavian empire, then expand into Britain, expand south into the territories of the HRE. The Turks is an interesting one in that you do face a lot of issues. There's a great deal of wealth to be had by expanding into the Byzantine territories, for example. But as we noted earlier, you have the Mongols and the Timurids to contend with. So I think I was quite lucky there to have a successful Turks campaign when so many other issues can affect gameplay in the sort of mid to late game in particular. So in terms of a list, it's interesting to see a lot of the success, a lot of the power coalescing around Central Europe, around Italy, and around Northern Europe. And I think one of the major factors here is the map itself, is the geography of medieval two's world. Obviously, far less a factor IRL. But in this instance, geography really counts. The immediate wealth and defensive integrity of sort of Italy and the Italian peninsula, the isolation of island of Scandinavia and the islands of Great Britain and Ireland, all allow those factions to rise to the top. Whereas factions that sort of are less geographically advantageous, perhaps, have more of those issues. When you look at Poland and Hungary down the bottom there, these are factions that have enemies coming from all angles, and because of that, struggled, I suppose, to score points. Now it's interesting that I scored them in only 3 areas because there wasn't much I could pull out, if you like, from medieval 2. So territories, income, and battles won upon culmination of campaign, and there's some examples there that are worth highlighting for that extent. For that extent there. So, Spain, for example, it's quite a peaceful campaign. Once you've beaten the Moors, you've basically achieved the Reconquista and you've taken control of Iberia. You don't fight many battles. So that was one where territories-wise and income-wise probably did fairly well, but just didn't fight many battles. So obviously didn't win many battles. So yeah, it's not a perfect kind of it's not a perfect analysis, but yeah, I think you can kind of see the extent to which geography more than other factors influences which factions rise to the top. And of course, if you are involved in a lot of wars, you're going to get additional benefits from the battles won. So again, Milan having long drawn out conflicts with neighbors. So combining kind of like geographic, if you will, strategic positioning with local rivalries is kind of what would get you up the ladder board here. Just as another sort of like talking point, I pulled out the plague deaths. So with all of the factions, I just noted down the total deaths per turn, which came to about 650,000. Now, looking at the population in medieval 2, I sort of calculated a ratio of 15 to 1, or there more exactly 14.46 to 1. And that was just looking at the populations of key cities at the start of the game and what the population of the cities was at a similar point in history. So I looked at, Paris, Constantinople, etc., and the ratio was approximately 15 to 1, let's say. So multiplying those two together, we get 9.5 million deaths from the plague, which is some way short of the historic reality. I think deaths from the plague are estimated more in the region of sort of 30 to as much as 50 million deaths across Europe. So that's an interesting point, that the Black Death, the plague mechanic, the plague the plague emergence in medieval 2 is very significant. It really halts your campaign in many ways. A, because you don't want to spread the disease. B, because your economy is starting to tank. C, because your armies may well be losing troops due to infection and death. But it's not as powerful as it might have been. They could have doubled or even tripled the sort of death rate in medieval 2 for the plague, and it would have been closer to our historical reality. And that really would be interesting, because that would be a fairly apocalyptic few turns if it was 2 or 3 times more powerful. So yeah, just something to note there. So going into Crusader Kings 2, as I've said, it plays very differently because of, you're not managing a nation per se. You are, which itself is anachronistic, as we've discussed, but you are controlling a dynasty. So when you score in Crusader Kings 2, you're scoring in a number of areas of how each leader of your dynasty has performed during their lifetime. And then those scores all get added up to your overall dynastic score. So this shows the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yes, so the top 10 scores, overall scores, for the 47 playthroughs I did of Crusader Kings 2. And this was over some time, and I kind of set myself objectives. And those were Supremacy, Crusade, or Survival. So Supremacy was simply to have the best playthrough I could, expand as best I could. Crusade was to accept every crusade and to accept and to transfer to the Crusader states. So when you participate in a crusade, if the crusade is successful, then your reward is based on your participation. So if you go over as a lowly count with a handful of troops, then you might fight for some time, but your overall contribution may be minimal. If that's the case, then you may well not get much of a reward at all, or you may be rewarded with a small territory. And then you have the option to either continue as your home territory or become the Crusader territory. So in each instance, I said I would always accept the transfer. So that obviously lands you in some pickles, because if you are that lowly count and then you get that small territory, then you perhaps don't have much say in how the Crusader state evolves. And quite often, the Muslim factions locally would counterattack, and you may well get wiped out. So some Crusade playthroughs were quite tricky. And then the last one is Survival, which is where I picked. So all of the characters I picked to play as were sort of real historical characters that had an interesting story to tell. And Survival was exactly that. Put me in a circumstance that was particularly troublesome and see if I could beat history, as we did with the Roman Republican faction. So an example here is the de Comines there in France. So there is actually a more significant, more powerful line of the de Comines family dynasty in southern France, but this particular line is at the start of the game there in 1066 is controlling Carcassonne, which is fantastic place to explore, IRL. Lovely part of France. But yeah, you're an older single man, no heirs, and if you lose your territory, then well, your heir is your sister, I think, who's married. So that was a campaign that very easy to lose very early on. If your liege lord, takes a disliking to you, they could just remove your one territory, and that's a game over. Or if you succumb to disease, which in Crusader Kings 2 can just happen fairly randomly at any point, then your heir would be your sister, whose subsequent heirs would be of a different dynasty, because she's in a sort of an orthodox marriage, if you like. And so, yeah, your last territory passes from your dynasty, and that's also a game over. So the campaigns had different objectives, but ultimately these were sort of the most successful. So these are filtered by score, which is down the middle there. What I tried to do was to create a different way of scoring it, because obviously, if you start in an earlier start date, as you can see there with the Ashina and the Dula, it's obvious you are going to end up with a higher score. You've played more characters, you're topping it up with more, with more, lifetime achievement scores, if you will. So I've done a score per year, which gives you a slightly different indication. I also factored in difficulty. So at the start of the campaign, you do get sort of a difficulty rating based on the starting condition. Ashina at the top there, you start out as a very powerful sort of empire level horde. So the difficulty is 0. So there's no multiplier there. With other factions, obviously your difficulty level goes up until to come in, as I've described, being one of the more difficult. Gets a multiplier based on the difficulty. And then at the very end, score per year plus. I may well share my spreadsheets, but I am a bit of a data person. So I kind of enjoyed sort of fleshing this out a wee bit. But I suppose, just getting back into it then. So, how do these scores play out? Well, at the very top, you have the Ashina. So that ends, they're a horde faction. They actually are a Jewish faction. So my challenge there was to sort of create a powerful Jewish empire, which I did, based in Arabia. The Dula, I mean, that's a really great playthrough, playing as the Dula, sort of a warring Tengri faction. So Eastern paganism, and again, objective of creating a sort of powerful pagan empire in Eastern Europe, which we sort of did. The Dauferidi, so here we're in Italy, and these are Lombards, and I was going after the Lombard sort of survival achievement in particular there. Again, was able to create an Italian empire. The Contville, so de Contville is actually Odo, who we would know as Odo de Bayeux, person who likely commissioned the Bayeux tapestry. Odo was a half brother of William the Conqueror, and was sort of a warrior monk character. Didn't have an heir himself, so it's sort of ahistorical to kind of lead with that dynasty. But here I was looking to sort of prolong the Norman control of Britain, because the Norman dynasty, Duke William was successful, but ultimately the Norman dynasty was pretty short-lived. So that was about Norman versus indigenous sort of Saxon control, long-term control of the British Isles, and we did create, again, the Empire of Britannia with Jimena. That was the Reconquista, and creating the Iberian Empire, which we did. Decomin, like I said, it was more of a survival campaign. We bounced around quite a lot there. Ended up with kingdoms in Pomerania, I think, among other territories in Europe. Bamber, that was again creating an empire of Britain to rival the Normans. Bamber being, a Saxon dynasty. And then you got the Ottokaren, which actually became the Sergius II we saw earlier. So that was a crusade faction, where I was able to, successfully establish a crusader state, and eventually an Arabian Empire. Gideon was also another Jewish faction. I did convert. It was sort of survival, and quite frankly, I was overcome with Muslim rivals locally that were likely to take me out for religious reasons. And then the Drengo, well, this was an interesting one because these were sort of the um, sort of the very early Norman um, adventurers in southern Italy. So this was sort of creating a slightly different um, evolution of Norman control of Italy by going in with the Drengo family rather than the de Hautevilles, which are another faction there that tend to rise to dominance as they did historically as kings of Sicily. And also we have Bohemond, who was one of that dynasty who was involved in the First Crusade and occupied Antioch. And so this is more of a survival thing as well, because you are a small faction with many rivals. And again, we were able to create kind of a coherent sort of kingdom and empire within Italy. So those are my most successful factions in terms of total score. But as you can see, based on how you shake it out, it's quite difficult to know what's the best way of kind of putting these in order of overall success. I mean, what I've ended up doing there is the score per year plus. So this is modified for difficulty, divided per year, and it's the list on the very right. So at the top we actually have the Comte Ville. So I'm going to declare these guys the non-existent descendants of Odo, the half brother of Duke William, as the most successful dynasty of the medieval period. Dulo, with their pagan empire in Eastern Europe, second most, and then we go down. The only change from the factions we already looked at are the from Tibet, forming the Tibetan Empire and becoming the most powerful faction in the eastern part of the map. So, an interesting top 10 there of medieval dynasties and their sort of impact on the world. I think there's a few things that we can draw from it. I think, geography, much like with medieval too, it's had an influence here. It's very easy, if you like, to form the Empire of Britain. And it's then unsurprising that in the top 10, actually two empires of Britain are there. You do score based on prestige, so the higher office you hold for the longest time will lead to those higher points. So the de Contville and the Bamba, we achieved empire status fairly early by unifying all of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. So there's quite a prolonged period of scoring as the Empire of Britannia for those two factions. So geography plays a role there. Similarly, with the Dauphirini and the Drengo, we were able to form the Empire of Italy. And again, the longer you sit at the top of the feudal pyramid, the higher your score. So again, unsurprising there that sort of geography to a certain extent has led to two factions from Italy figuring as well. And that goes for the other factions also. You've got the Arabian Empire with the Otokalam, the Tibetan Empire, the Arabian Empire with the Ashina. So yeah, I mean, I think here we see how relatively straightforward it is, how much quicker it is in game to form regional empires for a start, and then to sit at the top of the chain. So I think this goes a certain extent to the third theme we talked about, and about how Crusader Kings 2 doesn't maybe do enough to model political and social evolutions of the medieval period, because it's easy to form large nations. There isn't that sort of underlying friction in terms of the sort of evolution of social structures sort of being out of step with social and economic factors that would destabilize that process. So I suppose it does, again, it's very much part of the game design and perhaps an underplaying of the complexities that come from social, economic, and the structural evolution of the medieval period as we move through that feudal period and we move into the mercantilist and we move into the modern period. So yeah, perhaps a reduction there in frictions that would be necessary to better represent the evolution of historical dynasties and their success over the period. So interesting. I thought I'd sort of like put these alongside each other. So on the left, you have the Paradox top 10. So again, this kind of portrays a little bit of what Paradox felt was success in Crusader Kings 2. For a start, you do have the score, and you obviously have the dynasties. So score-wise, if you achieve 100,000 points, then you've done exceptionally well. You know, you're at the top of the pile, and as you can see there, my scores exceed that. So I'm pretty happy with that. Pretty happy we can say that I've played Crusader Kings 2 successfully. So this is a good representation of what they feel success would look like. And yeah, so the Capets at the top, the von Habsburg then, you go down the Welfs, an emphasis on European factions. Rurikovic, okay, so we're Eastern Europe there. The Piast, slightly Eastern European as well, in sort of focusing on Poland. Komnenos being a Byzantine dynasty. And then a couple of Scandinavian dynasties. So they have looked to put a variety in there, and obviously they're looking to scale it. These aren't the top 10, but this is sort of a scale of what, ultimate success to sort of lesser success might look like. But what I've got on the far right, so I've got my scores in the middle, and then on the far right is top 10 medieval dynasties according to Useful Charts, which is a fantastic channel that looks at family trees and kind of graphical representations, if you like, of historical experiences. And it's interesting to see what parallels there are between that historical analysis and sort of Paradox's gamified analysis are. And they do agree on a few, don't they? So you've got the Capet at the top again. You've got the Habsburgs in at second. You've got the Welf and the Ivrea. And obviously, Useful Charts, they aren't looking at sort of a diversity, but they've highlighted some of the same families as Paradox. But then you look through the Useful Charts list, it's a heavy focus on Germanic factions, and it's quite surprising, really, just how many. I mean, the way Useful Charts have done it there is basically in terms of similar to how it would be scored in Crusader Kings 2, sort of longevity and title. So, what level of titles did these dynasties hold, and how long did they hold them for? So it is a sort of Crusader Kings 2-y representation of sort of historical scoring, if you like. But there's a heavy emphasis on basically Germanic factions. In the vast majority of them come from German areas. So it's interesting to think just how successful through the medieval period into the modern period, dynasties that originated sort of within the HRE in a simplistic sense were at networking outside of that empire, and that's not represented particularly in my gameplay at all. That wasn't really an objective of mine, let's say, but the sort of successful dynasties that I'm seeing aren't limited to Central Europe. They are pretty diverse and often come from native dynasties, from dynasties having success in their native territories. So the Ashina do move from the step down to Arabia in my gameplay, but the Dulo, they originate in Eastern Europe and their success is born of dominance in that territory. The Dawfaridi, similarly. I mean, most of those factions in the list, gain their power and prestige from success in their home territories. Their empires expand greatly from, maybe just the one territory to whole, maybe from the one county to whole empires. But it is very much about building strength and building power in your home territory. Whereas useful charts, as a historical representation of this, is a lot more about dynastic networking and marrying into dynasties, marrying into title, and then holding those titles for generations. It's a feature of the gameplay in Crusader Kings 2. You can marry into other dynasties. Of course, it's a very, it's particularly in the early game, if you're a minor character, through marriage and through managing those networks is a way to sort of climb the feudal ladder and to develop, a local network. But truly achieving those higher scores in Crusader Kings 2 is more about dominance of your home territories and less about networking through the continent, if you will. So I think that's interesting in and of itself, And again, it kind of goes to the feudal thing. It goes to the dynastic nature of medieval politics. That we're a lot more than we need a lot more than military expansion, as we see in Medieval 2, and perhaps even in Crusader Kings 2. We need sort of greater emphasis on dynastic networking and less on sort of individual betterment. But yeah, interesting comparisons there. And I think it's quite fascinating to think of a medieval world where we come out of the medieval period with, let's say, the Ashina as a prominent sort of multi-faith empire in the Middle East, the Dulo of significant Tengri pagan empire in Eastern Europe. Yeah, I mean, you can look down the list there with the Ottokaren leading again, kind of a multi-faith, but primarily Christian empire in Egypt. I mean, it is a very different world. So finally, yeah, just a few observations then to wrap it up. So as we've just said there, so what are the differences? So particularly with Crusader Kings 2, minor faiths such as Tengrism and Judaism control significant territories and nations. I mean, this is very interesting. How different could our history be if there was a multi-faith, Judaic, Islamic, Judeo-Muslim sort of empire spanning the Middle East, headed by the Ashina dynasty. Similarly, if paganism, I mean, this is one of the great joys of playing these games and exploring these alternative realities. What if paganism really was a force in Eastern Europe? We might have simply not had the Orthodox Church, exist in any meaningful way into the modern world, where the Balkans, Greece, Anatolia would have been pagan. I mean, what would have that led to? Maybe the Crusades would have been far closer to home, forcing paganism out of the Balkans as Crusaders forced paganism out of the Baltic states, in our timeline. Maybe if that were the case, the Crusades would have never reached the Holy Land because they would have been more concerned with conflict in the Balkans, let's say. But then if you have a multi-faith empire in the Middle East, maybe there would have been no desire to go to war for religious reasons in the first place. Fascinating stuff. Early consolidation with empires in Italy, Britannia, Arabia, and Hispania. Again, major power centers. Many years hundreds of years earlier than our history, but major power centers in Italy, major power centers in Britain, major power centers in Arabia and Spain, and drawing wealth and power again, sort of as we note below, those major power centers drawing wealth into the Mediterranean, into Italy, into Spain, but also into kind of the extreme, so into Britain, and sort of away from Central Europe. I mean, you kind of see a wealth and power being almost sucked out of Europe to its extremes. And in a way, does this prepare us for the modern world? Does this prepare us for colonization and expansionism with power, prestige, and the desire for greater expansion, heading out of Europe? But yeah, interesting that it's kind of reflected in both. In terms of these observations, I've obviously focused a lot more on Crusader Kings 2 because there is just a little bit more sort of diversity of outcome really with Crusader Kings 2. Again, this is the nature of gameplay design, because with Medieval 2 and with Total War, the emphasis remains military expansion and territorial expansion, and there isn't a lot of diversity of outcomes there, rather than who's got the biggest land sort of thing. So yeah, interesting to observe that in both instances, however, we get major focuses of power and strength and wealth in kind of the peripheries of Europe and into the Middle East. And as we've said, whether that's because of faith or because of social structure or anything, a very different medieval world to the one we have experienced in our own historical timeline. All right, guys, well, thanks for listening to this ramble through two of my favorite games in the series. We'll be moving on to a new time period coming up. We'll be looking at the early modern period, slightly problematic timelines to explore there too, but might well see you there, and thank you very much for tuning in.